have a very special moment today, actually. It's the first time that Ryan Steck is meeting one of his favorite authors, David Morrell. Now, David is known as Rambo's daddy, and he's award-winning and best-selling author of thrillers, short stories, horror novels, comics, essays, espionage tales, historical novels, and much more. Name a genre, and he's probably written in it. His unparalleled career spans over 50 years, and he is also a very gifted teacher. In his spare time, he co founded the International Thriller Writers, and I'd like to welcome to Thriller Talk today, David Morrell.
Hi, Kimberly. Nice to see you again.
Anyway, as I mentioned in the introduction, David, unlike many authors who have built their entire careers on one single character, you've straddled many genres in your work and created endless protagonists. What are the disadvantages and advantages of having a body of work that is so varied?
There was a time when um, readers and editors didn't mind if you moved around, where the readers bought the author, not the kind of book that the author wrote. Now, I started with First Blood back in 1972, so I've seen all these changes. And I don't know. Well, what I tell authors to do when I'm teaching is you have to be true to yourself. And if you're going to if you feel that's what you want to do is try different genres as I have, well, that's you. So go ahead and do it. I finally realized that was my brand. That when you read one of my books, you never know what you're going to get because they're all going to be unique. But it's possible that this is not great career advice. It might be good personal advice. As you know, I say this isn't a profession, this is a vocation. And if you believe it's a vocation and that it's part of your self expression, then do what I do. But if you are going to treat it more like a business, if you're going to, as a profession, then you might want to think twice about going in different directions. But here's the capper, and then I promised before we started that I wouldn't drone on. But the capper is that people who tend, with exceptions, because we can think of Lee Child, for example, with or Michael Connolly, with exceptions, people who tend to write the same thing and are successful have around, give or take, 20 years. And then at that point, they get sick of it at the same time their readers get sick of it. But there are exceptions. But in my looking over all these years, that has been my observation. So I believe that you and I would not be talking if I had stayed, say, with espionage as I did with Brotherhood of the Rose. If I'd stayed with that, I think years ago I would have stopped publishing. So, that too is a balance. Do you want a long career, in which case you have to explore? In 50 years, I think we'd agree is a long career. Or do you want the focus of that steadiness that having a character or a certain kind of book gives you? It's a matter of personal identity.
Well, I love that too, David, because you've always told me that if you're going to devote a year of your life to a book, you want to grow and learn and change.
Yes, absolutely.
And so, with that in mind, is if you had to choose any of your characters you've ever written about as a dinner companion, which one would it be?
Oh, Thomas de Quincey, without question. I wrote three novels about him. Victorian, actually Regency person, also most famous for writing an expose or personal memoir called Confessions of an English Opium Eater at a time when laudanum, a beverage of alcohol and opium that was in everybody's medicine cabinet as the only effective painkiller, but we know it had other effects. And he became an addict at a time when there was no word addiction. It was called a habit. And so he was brilliant, one of the few, because of drugs, was a brilliant writer. And he invented the word subconscious. He anticipated Freud's theory of psychoanalysis by 50 years. He inspired Poe, who went on to invent the mystery story, and we know where all that led. And he did a lot of other things, and he was just absolutely brilliant, a true, unique innovator. And he had a wonderful daughter named Emily, who was actually my favorite character. If I could, if it were possible, it would be definitely a goal to sit down with those two.
Well, David, thank you so much for coming on. Like most of your fans, I would have picked Rambo. By the way, I would definitely want to sit down with John Rambo. Which kind of brings me to this. I know you've been asked this a
He
million
doesn't
times.
talk much.
I want his autograph. Then we'll just eat and I'll just have fun with it. But look, I know you've been asked this a million times. Like so many, I'm such a huge fan of First Blood. Rambo, one of my favorite characters. Let's go back to 1972. How did you come up with the story idea for that book?
I was a Canadian in graduate school at Penn State, and the terms of my being a foreign student were that I should not have political opinions, that I was a guest. And I took this seriously, the same as if I were in somebody's home for dinner and I disagreed with their politics. I would not start a discussion about it in that context, because the guest host relationship is an important one. But in 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Robert Kennedy was assassinated. The Vietnam War demonstrations were paralleled by civil rights demonstrations, and often they were related because an inordinate amount of blacks couldn't get a deferment in order to go to Vietnam, in order to avoid going to Vietnam. And so that year, and I like to say it this way, but it's more dramatic and it emphasizes it. There weren't 10 riots. There weren't 20 riots. There weren't 50 riots. There was not 100 riots. There were several hundred riots. And these were big time riots, similar to what last year was like, only there weren't as many of them last year on both sides. And to this day, parts of Gary, Indiana, Detroit, Los Angeles, and we could name others, have still to this day not recovered. And watching all this as a guest, I thought that maybe there was going to be a civil war. And with the fears in the United States at the moment are beginning to look a lot familiar to 1968. So I had the idea of a Vietnam veteran coming back from Vietnam. It's one of those moments where these things come from. But I thought I'll bring a Vietnam vet back, but he's been disaffected. He hates what happened to himself over there. He found out he was good at killing, and he hates that about himself. And he wanders the United States to see what he fought for, and he grows long hair, he grows a beard. And in 1968, which is sort of when the novel is set, even though it comes out in 72, in 1968, if you had beard, if you were a male with long hair and a beard, you were guaranteed to have trouble with the police. It was just automatically you, with you as kempt as you are, and with my mustache, which I grew for research, I know what happened to me, and you can't imagine what would have happened to you. So I had this imagination, what. So the fastest gun in the West has returned, and people are going to go after him, even though he fought for what they believed in. And what's he going to do? And that was the core of it. And I wanted to alternate the police chief Rambo, because they both think they're right. And that's what happens in life.
Mhm.
You never get anybody to say, oh, I'm evil, or I'm this, or I'm that, or I'm wrong. Everybody thinks they're right. Very few people will admit a mistake. So the gist was to alternate it back and forth. So we'd sympathize with the police officer until we were in Rambo's point of view, and then we'd sympathize with him, and then we'd be back to the police officer, go back and forth until we couldn't choose between them. And when the catastrophe struck at the end, hopefully the reader would have this massive conflict So that's basically how it came about.
Well, I recently reread First Blood, and I couldn't believe it. 50 years later, it felt like such a current book. Like you said, that amazed me. And I would love to ask you. You write phenomenal action. Never forget that scene in the dark, or the fight scene in the dark room. But one
Yeah,
of the things,
yeah.
love and love for you to chat about that for a second. But one of the things I love about your books is the emotional content in them. How do you balance that emotionality with, the kind of what's expected in a thriller, pacing and intensity?
Well, I mean, we're storytellers, so naturally we want to move the piece along. So that's a given. And then within that context, how do we engage the reader? Well, one way to do it, the most common remark made to me is that when people read my books, they feel like they're in a movie. But it's wrong because a movie is all about sight. And my goal is to take sight for granted and have at least two other senses in any scene, in every scene, so that this is a term that John Barth taught me, triangulation, that those three senses, one of which is minimized, that of sight, will triangulate the reader into feeling within the scene. If you use only sight, which alas most writers do, you're going to have a flat one-dimensional effect to the degree that you use those other senses, and you have to incorporate them so they're hidden. It has to be subliminal. Otherwise, it's obvious. You have to trick the reader into feeling, and so that I don't have. I sometimes do. Well, I don't. Somebody will think. Well, I think that instead I use I feel that as part of the way of stimulating that part of a reader. So to make the reader feel within the scene, feeling is so important. And if that happens, we will identify with the characters. It doesn't matter how good or bad in terms of ethics the character is. If we are in the scene with that character, we will identify with that character. So that's basically the method that I've always used.
Love it.
Well, from First Blood to Brotherhood of the Rose, you've written so many iconic novels. Is there one that was particularly challenging for you, looking back on them now?
Well, First Blood took 3 years, and I was learning. So naturally, that would have taken some time. The second book, Testament, took 3 years as well, because as some of the good folks watching us know, the first book is hard, the second book is harder, because we know kind of now what it's like, what it's about, and we have somewhat higher standards. So things that we sort of did automatically before, we maybe see through them and say, well, that was kind of easy. What if I did it this way? So I think there's some more second guessing. In the age before ebooks and before self-publishing, there were some astonishing statistics about the number of authors who had published a first novel who never published a second one. And that's the hurdle to get over. So easily, I think Testament was my most difficult book. Although, as Kimberly knows, I'm writing a Western at the moment because, hey, it's another genre. And but Westerns are particularly difficult because everybody thinks they understand them and all those common tropes. And so if you're going to do it, you have to find a way to do the tropes that in a way nobody's ever seen before. And God bless me, I'm now starting my third year on my Western, wondering maybe I'll never finish it. I don't know. I'm in my eighth draft of the book when I normally only do three. But I'm really committed, and I have to be honest. So I don't, I could say, "Oh, that's good enough," but it isn't. If it isn't good enough, you have to keep going. So anyway, those are a few examples.
Well, I really respect your dedication, and I can tell you I will be first in line for that Western. So please keep writing. I'm
Y-
excited.
you'll be the one. There is no market for westerns. I mean, but when it speaks to you, like
Mhm.
you and I know in at international thriller writers at the conferences when writers, especially the really major established writers get together, they often say, "Well, the book I really want to write is,
Mhm.
but my editor, my publisher won't let me do it." I mean, I've heard that a lot, and I get it. They say, "All right, I can go straight," but I don't. I have the freedom because everybody now expects that I'll do it, and I don't know, it became like a matter of my personal identity that this was a book that I was going to write.
Yeah, well, you'll definitely never be bored, David, with all your creativity and going in different directions.
We
So,
don't know. We don't know.
and so a lot of people watching today will be aspiring authors or newer authors. If you had to give one piece of advice to people writing today, what would it be?
Well, it's a twofold piece of advice, and some viewers will have heard me say this because it's what I say all the time. And we preface it by saying that my writing teacher, a man named Philip Klass, whose pen name was William Tenn, he was a science fiction writer in the 50s. And when I was at Penn State remarkably had hired a professional writer. Imagine a professional, doing a day by day, earning a living writer to be their writing instructor. And he was very kind to me and he talked to me at length about a lot of things. And one of the things he said was, if you look at the ones that went the distance, and he mentioned, I'll just, Hemingway, Gertrude, or not Gertrude Stein. Come on, now I'm having one of those moments. Who Age of Innocence? Please help me. Who wrote Age of Innocence? Oh, now I'm going to be embarrassed. In any case, he went through some of the classic American writers and said they are all recognizably themselves, recognizably different. Edith Wharton, thank God. Edith Wharton. They are recognizably different from each other. And when we go to them, we know what we're going to get. I mean, nobody ever went to, oh, good, I'm going to read an imitation Edith Wharton novel. I'm going to read an imitation Ernest Hemingway novel. You don't do it. You go for the original. And so he said, you have to decide who you are. And he had a theory about dominant emotions, that everybody has a dominant emotion that makes them unique. It might be jealousy. Some of them are hard to face up to: jealousy, hatred. In my case, it was fear. I remember doing this, and somebody came up and says, "Mine is lust." So I said, "Oh, well, that if you can write an honest lust novel, there aren't very many of them." And so he said, it was important to write to your strength, which is yourself. So the two rules are: be a first-rate version of yourself, and not a second-rate version of another author, which applies to life as well as writing. And the other is, because these go together, don't chase the market, because you'll always see its backside. If
Mm.
you're a first time author and you're chasing the market, it'll leave you. And now, if you write true to yourself, at this moment there is a chance that it will not be published, and for many reasons. That's why God invented e-publishing. But nonetheless, I believe that if you are true to yourself, you will find a way for that that book to be available. Whereas if you're not true to yourself, you've wasted your time. So I anyway, those are my pieces of advice.
Well, before I ask my question, I'll just say this: you are probably right. There's not a big market for westerns if you're me or Kim or someone else. But I'm pretty sure when they put your name on it, there's going to be a big market for that western when you finish it, and I'll be second in line behind Kim. So,
Well, think about this. This is the 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 Western is one of the few authentic American genres. We have the mystery story. If we want to get out of a genre, we have the Broadway musical, we have jazz. There are very few unique, authentic American art forms. So that a novel, a Western, has to be about the nature of the American West. So it's a big thing. And most Westerns do not address that topic. It will be different in as much as my ambitions for it, or whether I succeeded or not, is another matter. But it will be, it will be of its own kind.
Well, we're excited for it. But coming back to Rambo, just for a second, you were pretty vocal
Sure.
about not being a fan of the latest film, which I was really glad about because I did not like it. I saw it and I told Kim this before we started shooting. I said, "Man, I saw the new movie and I hated it." And I thought, I don't want to talk about this at all. Got on Twitter and you beat me to it. So I thought, oh, perfect. I can tell everyone I don't like it now. But aside from that, like many of
Yeah,
your fans, I'm just curious. If John Rambo were alive today, what would he
yeah.
be doing? Other than the obvious answer of sitting in a wheelchair, what would John be doing today?
Well, Rambo is a loner. I mean, he's not a social person. So in various iterations over the years, I wrote a couple of treatments for Rambo films I was hired to do. And I also wrote a screenplay that Carolco hired me to do, but that was in a vocation they didn't want to use. And I know some of the other ideas that have floated around. Um, in one which I invented and was my favorite, he was a wilderness guide that there are these places where children can go to learn about the outdoors, or where campers. I was a graduate of something called the National Outdoor Leadership School, and I saw him as somebody living in the forest, as it were, in the wild, but in an environment where he was teaching people. And This struck me as being a wholesome, a holistic way. In one of the films, in the third film, he's in a monastery. But whatever it is, he's going to be a loner. Now, the fifth film, the recent one, wasn't wrong for him to be on a ranch, because I envisioned First Blood, the novel, as being a form of a western. The gunfighter who wasn't allowed to hang up his guns, and so to move him into a western environment, I thought was really a terrific idea. Where it went was another matter, but but above all, he's animals, the outdoors, a limited amount with people, just simply because he doesn't have any use for them. He learned about himself and about. Sometimes I think we're a failed species, and he sort of, I think, felt that, and is best when he's in that circumstance.
He probably wouldn't have been too bothered social distancing and spending time in quarantine last year then.
He would not have any problem with that, and because he understands protection so well, he wouldn't have had any problem with a mask either. Rambo doesn't have any problem about being a sissy. I sometimes, God help me, I sometimes wonder if not wearing masks is somehow, if people don't think they're manly enough if they have a mask on. Who knows why? But anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, he would wear a mask.
So he'd be the perfect dinner time companion in quarantine. It's
Yeah,
like he'll wear a mask,
he
social
just
distance.
shut up. He doesn't talk much in the movies. So
I love it, but hopefully he's a good listener.
yeah,
So, with respect to, I know you're a big fan of Gone Girl, and that
yeah.
transformed our genre. Can you please speak to that for a minute, and then maybe give some insight into the fact that psychological or domestic thrillers are still so incredibly popular, and we're like, 9 years out now.
Yeah. Well, there were a couple of books that made a big difference. In 2003, the Da Vinci Code made a big difference by bringing back a particular kind of historical modern thriller. And then the Girl with the Dragon Tattoo with a strong, strong feminist tone to it. And then Gone Girl. And Gone Girl interests me because of the technique. And, for years, I went to writers' conferences and said, if you're going to write a first person narrative, you have to go back and think about it the way Henry James did in a book like the Turn of the Screw, where the first person, James said the first person is best when the main character is deluded, insane, or tricked. When I mean deluded, let's say biased in the third, where we cannot trust that character. And remember, James's brother was the inventor of American psychology. And so I would go and say, look, it wasn't something I wanted to do. And afterward, I pointed out the wisdom of what I had suggested, that if you're going to write a first person narrative, it should be about the nature of first persons and how we can delude ourselves or else lie to other people, which is exactly what Gone Girl was, where we have two characters who are, we're getting this information, but it's all wrong. It's all biased. And even as short a time as 3-4 years ago, I was at a writers' conference giving a lecture on the first person and saying, that you should take the first person as part of your subject matter. And else, why are you writing it in the first person? And I got, you wouldn't believe the notes that were handed in. Worst presentation I ever saw. This guy doesn't know what he's talking about, and on and on and on. And so I don't lecture about the first person anymore. It's like, stale bread on the water or whatever. But it fascinated me that the truth of Gone Girl persisted, so that book after book after book, often with a man couldn't write the girl with, but that or woman in the title, that, that it's still going on, that domestic suspense, or sometimes called domestic noir, became so popular. This is 11 years later, and that book is still having its influence. And it's interesting, and also it spoke to a generation of people who had grown up with expectations. In Gillian Flynn's case, I may be extrapolating, but I believe this is so. She had worked for Entertainment Weekly, and then the 2008 recession hit, and she was writing that book in response to what had happened to her generation for that recession. So it spoke to a generation in ways that that happens so seldom. Anyway, yeah, I'm a big fan of the book. It's got many layers, and it was historically important.
Well, David, so many writers, most recently Jack Carr, we talked about before we started shooting, have credited you in some way as someone who has had a major impact on them. So I'm curious, which writers have been influential to you over your career?
Well, we have to remember, I come up through a graduate school environment, and I was a professor of literature for many years. So I mentioned Henry James. Henry James had a huge influence on me, and his theories about fiction, which would take a long time to elaborate here, but James would certainly be at the top of the list. And then after that, I went to Penn State specifically to study Hemingway with a professor named Philip Young, who became like a father to me. And Hemingway, his attitude toward writing, which was find a way to do it that hasn't been done, and that will in 10 years or 20 years still feel fresh if you're lucky, that really had an impact on me. James M. Cain, his dialogue in novels like The Postman Always Rings Twice and Double Indemnity, that, I mean, his technique is so there. There's no hiding it. It is right in your face. And every author should read came, those two, because it's just like a lesson in the basics of how to put a book together, especially with the dialogue. And then Jeffrey Household, who was a British suspense writer, often in a nature environment. His most famous book, Rogue, Rogue, Rogue Male, Male, 1939, is about a British big game hunter who stalks Hitler on the eve of the Second World War. And I mean, what a cool idea, but here's an even cooler idea. He gets caught on the first page. And what happens after that is the book. And then eventually he winds up living in a hole in the ground, and the bad guys track him down and seal up the hole. And when Philip Klass, William Tenn, he would read some of my earlier short stories, which tended to be in that direction. He said, "You've been reading Jeffrey Household." And I didn't know who Jeffrey Household was. So he lent me Rogue Male and Watcher in the Shadows. And I came back and said, "You mean you're allowed to write this way?" And that was it. Then I started First Blood. So those four and John Barth. I did my doctoral dissertation on John Barth, and I quoted him about technique earlier, about using other senses besides sight, and he had a big effect on me as well.
I love hearing about your path, David, because when people come into your lives and influences, as you have done for me, it's forever. You're forever grateful because
Yeah,
there's such a gift of being able to share the knowledge, and then with each person they interpret it different ways too, right? So that's I love that. It's sort of like a symbiosis. Um,
yes.
and with respect to not only are you an incredibly talented writer, you're also a really savvy businessman. So we talked before about contracts and different things. From a business perspective, what advice would you give people that are coming in newer? There's so many choices these days. You could go with indie, you could go with traditional. What advice do you have for people from a business perspective?
Well, are you talking about e-publishing versus traditional, or contracts, principles of contracts?
I think whatever you prefer, but I just think like if there's one sort of focus you could say, you're
Well,
gonna.
yeah, there is one. I'll tell you, we can go a little longer if you want, because as you know, I go on. Uh, we are Canadians, and a Canadian personality who interests me a great deal is a singer-composer named Paul Anka. Okay. Now, he and I are roughly contemporaneous, and he had an amazing career and still has a career. When the American pop scene ended, he learned Italian and went to Italy and became a star. He learned Spanish and went to South America and became a star. And then when his time was right, he was back in the United States doing his thing. And he did something. He adapted, but he did something that I think about often when I'm doing a contract. His early songs, Diana, You Are My Destiny, etc., all were recorded through a company called ABC Paramount. And ABC Paramount went out of business. And to generate some income, they offered their artists the control over the masters. And Anka, who was now not a star, who was sort of, saying, I got to learn Italian to go to Italy to be a star and record in Italian. They said, and think about this in dollars of the time, they said, we'll sell you all your masters. I think there were 25 or 30 of them for $250,000. A fortune. And he had no hesitation. He found the money and he bought the masters, which gave him, and here's the word, control over his early career, and it wouldn't impede with later ones. And think about people like Britney Spears, who is forever, we read, in conflict with an earlier studio she recorded with, because she doesn't have control of those masters. So whenever I am in a negotiation, I'm saying, all right, like for ebooks, this cannot be eternal. It's a print book and there's an ebook. Okay, it's easy to say for a print book when it's out of print. By definition, there are no more print copies. But with an ebook, it's eternal. So you must have in the contract somewhere a definition of when an ebook goes out of print. So a number, or else overseas, of course, they do it as a license for a specific number of years. And after, let us say, 7 years, all that comes back to you and you can renegotiate. So one of the things that I talk about a lot with my agents is 5 years, 10 years, or I'm not young anymore. I have to look at my estate. I have to look at people who then control my estate afterward. How can we guarantee that they have control later? And not, a publisher having infinite, and they might be selling only 5 ebooks when the estate could figure out ways to do something with those titles. So my logic in all negotiations is, how can I get control? Now, obviously, a publisher's, has the right, to publish the book and all that, but we're looking ahead down the road. How do I make sure that it isn't out of my control forever? I do the same thing with movie contracts. I insist on a condition that after 8 years, if the film is not made, and I have a lot of movie contracts, I have 4 each year, nothing ever happens, but it's like, there they are. But in each of the contracts, I stipulate that after 8 years, if that movie isn't made, if they exercise the option, they buy the property, if after 8 years it isn't made, I have the right to repay them in order to get the property back, if I choose to. And now there are conditions and all of that, but I don't know many people who have that in their contracts. It's a given with me because I had a bad experience and I learned from that. So, do what you can to keep control of as much as you can.
Great advice.
Great advice. I think there's going to be so many people that watch this that are going to benefit from that. Before we let you go, David, you've teased this Western. We're all dying to read it. Is there anything else you can tell us about it before you
I
head out?
can. Yes, it takes place in 1888. Which doesn't tell you anything, but it's in that year for a very specific reason that I can't talk about. And it is the subtitle is A Novel of the American West, and it will within itself also have not only the history of the American West up to 1888, but it will have the history of the Western genre as well. So it is a Western about Westerns as much as it is a Western itself. And that's part of the reason it's taken so long, because, there's just a lot. And then learning, just to give you one example, it took me a long time to realize, the Sitting Bull and the Native American massacre of Custer and the 7th Cavalry in 1876 at the Little Bighorn. I mean, and I'm a professor. My specialty is American studies, for God's sake. And it was only 2 months ago, reading a wonderful book by a man named Richard Slotkin about the true significance of events in the American West, that I realized that massacre occurred the end of June, just before July 4 on America's centennial. And that's one of the reasons why it got all the attention, because it is, as it were, an attack on the idea of America. So it's that kind of thing that I'm trying to build into the novel, so that we see events in a way that most people have never looked at before. And just another example, in 1890, people think, there are lots of movies about the end of the American West, and, they take it into the First World War. I did a novel comparable to that called Last Reveille. In 1890, the American census, the United States government declared the end of the frontier on the basis that most states and territories had over 1 million people in them. So that the West was really, from, as we understand it in terms of some Westerns, 1865, 1890. And then it was done. And one of the interesting things that happened in 1890 with the census saying the frontier is over, that was the year of Wounded Knee. That was the year of the massacre of the Indians at Wounded Knee, led by Sitting Bull, who was assassinated in reprisal to the 1876 massacre of Custer. And that was the end of the West. So these historical significances of all these are just overwhelming. And I don't know of anybody who's really come at it from that point of view.
So we're excited. I cannot wait to dive in.
But it still has to be a story, it still has to be a narrative.
That I think that's what I've always loved about your books, though, is that everything is steeped in reality and research. And I admire that, because when I read, I'm entertained, but I'm also educated. And I can't wait to learn more about the history in this Western, because it's something that you probably wouldn't go and pick up a textbook like you kindly did and to do all the research. But it's the information, I think, that gives us such joy. When you read, you're like, I didn't know that.
Yeah, exactly. To see it for a new way and then say, oh my heavens, oh my heavens. But, since we are kind of winding down, and you did give me ask me for advice earlier, and you alluded to something that I've said to you many times and that I apply to myself, is that given the fact that, at least for me, it takes a year to write a book, lately longer. So I have rules, right? So that's a long time. So I won't write a book unless its theme is personally important to me. That it is something so important to me that I want to investigate it. Two, that the research will be something that I want to learn about. I don't write about what I know about, I write what I want to learn about. And that the research will teach me so much that at the end of the book, I'll be a fuller person because of it. And third, that there has to be something about the book that hasn't been done before. It doesn't have to be major. We're not writing Joyce here. We're not writing The Sound and the Fury, but there has to be something about it that would be distinctive enough that people will say, it's like Creepers. Takes place 8 hours, and most of those 8 hours are in the dark. It's a novel that takes place in the dark. And those 8 hours, every instant of those 8 hours, including when people need to relieve their bladder, are on the page. There's no 5 minutes later. Those 5 minutes are on the page. So I had immense joy when I wrote Creepers to do those two things, which I didn't know had ever been done before. Not certainly to the degree that I was doing them. So, there's sort of maybe I have a limited attention span. I don't know, and I have to keep challenging myself. But that there's a joy in going at writing in a way that that follows those three rules that I just elaborated.
That's great. Listen, very, very helpful advice today. Great insights into what you're up to, and all those newer authors out there are going to benefit so much from your sage advice. So thank you so much. An auspicious moment, having Ryan meet you for the very first time, and hopefully not the last. We'll have some more fun another time.
You're going to come back when the Western comes out, right?
It's a date.
Yeah, 10 years from now, I guess. I don't know. This is like, I don't know. It's a big joke in our household. Have you got them off the mountain yet? No, they're not off the mountain yet. So, but
we know there's a mountain in this book too.
There's a mountain in it.
This comes out in 10 years, and they're going to start calling you David, George R. R. Martin, Morrell.
Yeah,
we got to get out before then.
All you can do is laugh about it. I mean,
always.
I'm in it, so that's if I'd known.
Thanks so much for joining us today.
Sure. My pleasure. Nice to meet Ryan.
Yes, thank you for coming, David.